So, hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I am delighted to be joined for the second time by Dr. Lee Jones, Professor of Political Economy and International Relations at Queen Mary and an Associate at the Second Cold War Observatory. Lee, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, not a problem. I mean, the first conversation was very interesting. So, given the tumultuous geopolitical climate that we currently live in, I thought it might be interesting to chat to you again. So would you like to give people like an overview of what the Second Cold War is before we maybe go into more details and discussions about what's going on at the minute?
Sure. So some people talk about a second Cold War, some people talk about a new Cold War. Essentially, when we talk about this, we mean a heightened period of geopolitical competition and rivalry between the major powers. So the United States and its allies on the one side, and then principally China, but also Russia on the other. And what distinguishes a Cold War from a hot war is that it's cold. So they don't directly go to war with one another militarily, but they pursue every other form of competition and rivalry short of war. And it's global in its reach. They are competing over technology, they're competing over markets, they're competing diplomatically, they're competing in infrastructure, or at least we're told that they're doing those things. And it seems that this hostility is baked in, that it's structural. It's not about leaders, it's not about policies, it seems to be a systemic problem. Has bipartisan consensus in the United States. One of the few things that Republicans and Democrats agree on is that China is bad. And this confrontation seems to be locked in. And I would argue that this geopolitical confrontation is going to characterize the rest of our lives, you and I. This is what's really going to be the kind of headline story in world politics. And it's going to affect us in all kinds of complex ways.
So what do you think the main areas of competition are in this new Cold War? Like, where are the key flashpoints, for lack of a better term?
I think, so there are flashpoints. There are kind of military flashpoints where there's a potential for things to boil over into a direct confrontation between the great powers. Ukraine is the obvious one because Ukraine is a proxy war between NATO and Russia. And that obviously has the potential to boil over into a nuclear confrontation. And there are flashpoints in East Asia, particularly the South China Sea, where the United States is backing the Philippines in particular to resist Chinese bullying and coercion in the South China Sea. And that is escalating tensions there and could potentially, I don't think it's very likely at the moment, but it's certainly likelier than it was, boil over into an accidental conflict between the US and China. So those are sort of flashpoints where a Cold War could become hot. But the nature of a Cold War, as I just said, is that it's not direct military confrontation. So the competition is happening instead in a number of different areas, particularly in respect of technology. So increasingly, the United States is trying to choke off China's technological development, particularly in areas to do with military application. So things to do with semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and so on. There's an attempt to keep China down and reestablish the United States technological supremacy and lead in these areas through trade restrictions and through industrial policy at home, by leaning on allies and other third parties to restrict China too. There is some competition supposedly over global infrastructure. So China has become the world's leading bilateral provider of development financing to developing countries, outpacing the World Bank. And that's provoked a lot of alarm, lots of claims that China's engaged in debt trap diplomacy, that it's engaged in winning allies and propping up dictatorships in the global south, for example. I think a lot of these claims are overblown, but that's the claim. And the G7 has launched an initiative, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, to try to challenge China in this space. there's also sort of generalized competition for critical minerals in particular, so strategic resources that are essential to the modern economy and also essential to the green energy transition. So there is competition there because China has a commanding lead in the processing of many of these critical minerals, rare earth minerals. So these are the kind of areas that we're talking about. A lot of these areas are technological and economic. They are connected to military. And the ones that are most connected to military are the ones where the West is most concerned and the competition is sharpest and they're doing most about it. They're actually doing very little to contest China in the global South in terms of being more generous by providing aid or infrastructure investment, for example. But in terms of their own capabilities, they're trying to safeguard those. So that's concretely what we're talking about when we talk about a second Cold War.
So do you think it's realistic to try and, for them, I mean, so you talked about the tech competition and the attempts to sort of cut off China's ability to advance in the areas of semiconductors, in microchips, in quantum computing. Is it realistic for them to attempt to make to attempt to cripple them on those issues, just especially when on trade China is still like the global supplier for a lot of stuff. So I just wanted to read out some stats here. So China's share of global GDP based on purchasing power parity is now 19% globally in 2024 compared to the US's 15%. China's trade surplus in October 2024 was reported at 95.7 billion, with exports rising 12.7% year on year. And they're on course to achieve $1 trillion trade surplus in 2024. Although that's just, projections, I think, at the minute. And they also lead in global manufacturing with a 31.6% share of total of manufacturing output compared to the US's 15.9%. Like, is it realistic for the US to attempt to go to war with them on this issue?
So the United States does have some advantages in this area, which do allow it gives it tools that it can weaponize global trade with. But I still don't think that you can choke off the supply completely. So your skepticism is warranted. So the benefit that the United States has is that US-based firms dominate in the design of semiconductors and the technology that is used to produce the most advanced semiconductors. They don't do the manufacturing themselves. They used to, but as part of globalization, the manufacturing was offshored to East Asia in the 1980s. But because the United States-based companies retain control of the design, the intellectual property, the technology that's used in the machines that actually produce these chips, they can restrict the sale and transfer of chips, manufacturing equipment and so on that contain this intellectual property. So it's not that the United States can simply, cut off supplies of chips from the US. They can say nobody that is using this intellectual property in that chip can provide it to China either. And because this intellectual property is present in so many devices, in so much manufacturing kit, that gives the United States extraterritorial reach. It basically means other countries have to enforce sanctions against China. And the United States can also, even when its technology is not implicated directly, as in, for example, some of the Dutch company ASML's manufacturing equipment, it can lean on its allies to say, well, actually, you should restrict your chip sales to China as well. And China is quite a big manufacturer of semiconductors itself, and it can also source high-end chips from other countries like Korea or Japan. But the really sort of high-end tech has American IP running through its veins, so to speak. So there is a way that you can choke off the most advanced technologies. Now, China can. There are. That's the advantage that the United States has, and that has created difficulties for the Chinese. There's no doubt about that. Even with the best will in the world, all the investment that they're throwing at this domestically, the anticipation is that they can only become 40% self-sufficient by 2030. And that will be at the lower end, the less complex chips, the chips that you need, the tiniest chips, the most advanced ones that can do AI, computing, that kind of stuff. Those are being sort of throttled off. Now, it's actually very difficult, though, to enforce sanctions. There's always, the Jake Sullivan, who is President Biden's national security advisor, likes to talk about a small yard with a high fence. And what he means by that is we're not trying to decouple from China completely. We're just sanctioning a small number of strategic goods. That's the small yard. And the high fence is we're trying to keep the Chinese out. But the difficulty is that defining what should be in the small yard is difficult because there's a lot of interplay between military technology and civilian technology. And there'll always be a lot of pressure on policymakers, I think, to make the small yard bigger. And the fence always has holes in it. So the target will always try to find ways to evade sanctions, especially when the stakes are high. And the stakes are extremely high here because semiconductors are in all modern technology. So the US might say, well, we're just concerned about the military applications. But the Chinese will rightly say, this is not about military applications. If you take semiconductors away from us, we can't actually develop. We can't climb up the value-added chain towards more advanced technologies. So the target will try to find ways to evade, and so will your own companies. So I think the United States firms today are actually less patriotic in a sense than they were in the Cold War because they've spent 40 years building up trade and investment ties with China. And this was said to be a good thing, right? This was going to convert the Chinese to liberalism. So they're deeply embedded in the Chinese economy. So a firm like Nvidia, for example, as soon as certain chips above a certain technological capability were banned for export to China, Nvidia immediately invented a new chip which was just below the export ban threshold. And there's plenty of evidence that American-made chips are still finding their way into China through third parties, front companies, and so on. The Chinese have been stockpiling ASML manufacturing kit as well. And it's very difficult for the United States to coordinate all the different partners that either have some skin in the game in this, that the US is not the only one that can supply this kind of technology. Others can as well, Europeans, the Japanese, the Koreans. It's very difficult to coordinate all these different partners. Not all of them are really on board. And China isn't like the Soviet Union. China is much more globally integrated than the Soviet Union ever was. As the stats that you read out, emblematize that. So China can evade much more easily than the Soviet Union could. And moreover, it's far better at adapting and diffusing technology than the Soviet Union ever was. The USSR was quite good at stealing technology through industrial espionage, and it could, recreate whole factories in the Soviet Union. But then it would then steal another factory and a third factory and a fourth factory. So what it wasn't good at was work with sort of reverse engineering so that you could copy that factory and then have copies all around the Soviet Union, whereas we know that China is excellent at doing that, stealing technology or acquiring technology in legitimate ways, and then reverse engineering it, and then applying it, diffusing it, building on it for indigenous innovation. So your skepticism is warranted, but it doesn't mean that this hasn't created severe difficulties for the Chinese. And the Americans would say, we know all that, right? What we're trying to do is throw some sand in the gears. We're just trying to slow them down. And that will just give us a bit of an edge for a bit longer.
Yeah, it's interesting I did a quick Google there about how many US companies or like tech companies basically are reliant. on China. So, and this may be like slightly out of date, but what I found it was that 19 high-tech US companies were found to have direct collaborations with Chinese military or state-owned enterprises. So that includes Dell, Google, IBM, Intel, Microsoft, Synopsys, Merrill Lynch. I'm not sure why they're included in this, but it's really interesting. Do you think it's do you think that's dangerous for the US generally? Like, in this sort of new Cold War, is it worrying that US companies are that reliant on China, or is that just sort of the world we live in?
Well, increasingly, the United States they've got this thing called the entity list, entities of concern, and it's mostly Chinese companies, but not exclusively. So anything that is linked to the Chinese military in particular, or is otherwise suspect, is added to this list, and United States firms are banned from doing deals with these entities. Of course, front companies could be established to get around these kind of restrictions on the Chinese side. I mean, the fact is that American technology has been absolutely fundamental to the development of China, and it remains fundamental to the development of China. In fact, they want to, the Chinese have become the great defenders of open borders and free trade, of globalization, because they need continued access to foreign markets for their exports and foreign technology to upgrade their economy. They can't become self-reliant overnight, even as they are. The Made in China 2025 program, which was launched in 2015, does aim at much greater self-sufficiency and technological upgrading in a whole host of strategic areas. So there is this kind of weird interdependence, a deep interdependence that has emerged. We used to talk back in sort of round about 2008. I think the historian Neil Ferguson dubbed it Chimerica, China and America, that it had become a single economic entity. They had become so closely coupled to one another. And others used to talk about the G2, the group of two, because really these were the big heavyweights that were going to dictate the way the world went. And that's a big difference from the first Cold War, because the Soviet Union and the United States were not economically interdependent at all. There was very limited economic interaction between the two blocs during the Cold War. Whereas this second Cold War is emerging in a context of hyperglobalization. Now, hyperglobalization has given way to what's called slowbalization, right? So the share of world GDP, the share of world GDP that's constituted by trade is now flatlining after increasing for a long time. So the degree of integration, the pace of integration seems to have slowed down, but the backdrop is decades of really immense integration of supply chains, of production networks, of ownership and control across borders. Now, the two economies, the United States and China, they are starting to decouple, but it's very slow and it's quite wrenching. And a lot of the actors that are involved that are making money out of it don't really want to step back from it on either side. So it's very difficult to disentangle. It's definitely not as easy as just slapping tariffs on China and seeing what happens.
Yeah, I mean, so before we get to the tariffs, I just wanted to I asked Grok if China has succeeded with the Made in China 2025 initiative. So I just to see what it spat out, basically. So it says China's become global leader in electric vehicles, which I know to be true, in solar energy, solar panels, and drones and unmanned aerial vehicles. They've got the largest high-speed rail network. And one of the largest robotics and automation industries, as well as 5G. They're one of the world leaders on. And then it goes on. There's a lot of stuff here, but basically it's saying that it kind of made at least some progress towards this, and that by 2049 they aim to be the sole leading global technical superpower. So it seems like they're also thinking maybe if we decouple a little bit from the United States, that they could accelerate ahead. Is that?
I'm not sure. I wouldn't perhaps go that far. So just to take a step back to Made in China 2025. So I think China has absolutely become a global leader in 5 of the technologies that were prioritized in this strategy. So you mentioned drones, solar panels, graphene is another one, high-speed rail, electric vehicles, and also LNG carriers. And they have made progress on some of the others. So commercial aircraft, semiconductors, AI, robots, machine tools, large tractors, and drugs. But they are quite far behind on semiconductors, and it's quite hard to catch up for some of the reasons that I've identified. Now, what are they trying to do? Are they trying to become the sole global technological superpower? No, I don't think that's their objective. I think they want to become a technologically leading country by 2049. It doesn't mean that they want to crush everybody else and everybody else goes, back to living in caves or something like that. It's the aspiration is that China becomes a high-tech, high-value-added, moderately prosperous society, as they put it. So what they're trying to do is what most developing countries want to achieve, which is to escape the so-called middle-income trap. So the way that most developing countries the successful ones have developed, is by inserting parts of their economy into regional or global production networks. So they attract companies that are offshoring. They attract manufacturing capital. They start with very basic stuff like garments. That's very low tech, low wage, low value added. But you earn a little bit of money out of that. But then you want to climb up the value added ladder. So you go to more technologically complex goods. You might move into basic electronics assembly or something like that, putting together an iPhone. And that gets you a little bit further and allows you a little bit more wealth to be captured in that economy. But a lot of countries stall at that point. They don't take the next step into the most technologically complex forms of production where you earn a lot of income, a lot of revenue. You're able to extract a lot of value. So if you think about an iPhone production, for example, the iPhone is assembled entirely in China. And back in 2011, it was calculated that the Chinese got about $3 per handset, because although they were putting it together, all the components were coming from elsewhere. A lot of the components were being imported from places like Taiwan, South Korea. And of course, the lion's share of the final retail price was taken by Apple, because they owned the intellectual property of the Apple iPhone. And so they could extract the lion's share, hundreds of dollars out of the final retail sale price. Now, that has now changed. So because China has been able to develop its own industry to produce some of these components, now something like 20% of the value of an iPhone is retained in China by Chinese firms, because they've been developing these new technologies. So for example, like the screen or the casing and things like that, they don't need to import these things anymore. So Chinese firms get more value out of the production of the iPhone. It's not only, the highly exploited workers putting the components together on the assembly line. It's now the generation of these high-tech components. And this is what China's aiming to do. It's to drag itself up the value-added ladder through intensive indigenous innovation, through acquiring foreign technologies, either through joint ventures or forced technology transfers or industrial espionage, or through mergers and acquisitions of technology. And it's incredibly successful at doing these things in a very short space of time. And I think above all else, it's doing it at enormous scale. So the sheer size of China is what, causes it to have these global repercussions. So the fact that China's become this leading producer of solar panels, for example, is the reason why renewables are now so cheap that it's cheaper to install solar panels than it is to burn coal. Because just last year, the price of solar panels halved because there is so many solar panels being produced in China. So it's not like a small economy like South Korea, which has developed in a relatively similar way. But, South Korea as an economy, as a population, is relatively small. It's smaller than the UK. So you can cope with that. But China is this massive continental economy with this enormous population. So it's doing all this at such enormous scale that it creates economic shockwaves across the entire world. So if you're trying to create your own green transition in Europe by developing your own solar panel sector or your own electric vehicle sector, and Chinese companies are, blasting their surpluses all across the world, how do you compete? That's the challenge in a lot of these areas. And then, of course, because China is moving very quickly in these high-tech areas, there's also potential, military spillover of these technologies. So it's economically threatening to Western powers that are, been stagnating economically, technologically, in terms of productivity for a long time. Whereas China has had, decades of breakneck growth, very high rates of investment, very high rates of technological progress. And so that gap between the powers is narrowing. And that's what I think freaks out a lot of people in Washington.
I mean, I think that at least America are competing on the sort of innovation side more than Europe. I think Europe is the portion of the West that seems to be the ones lagging behind, I would say, in a lot of these areas. Although, not that they're not trying at some point, but there's a lot you can do when you don't have to worry about elections. It's a lot easier to control an economy and to drive it in a direction that you want it to when you're, not concerned about what the people think, basically, to a certain extent.
Well, okay. I mean, I take your point, but I would think I would qualify it and say the Chinese Communist Party is intensely concerned with what the population think in the sense that there is a social contract essentially between the CCP and the people, which is that the CCP provides continuously rising living standards and the people remain politically acquiescent and also acquiescent in the workplace, crucially, and let the CCP dominate them politically and indeed economically in terms of the surplus extraction of the working class. So that's the deal. And, actually growth rates in China have slowed tremendously with two kind of big shocks, one being the global financial crisis, which kind of halved the average growth rate of China from around 10% to about 5%, and then COVID, which from which really the Chinese economy has never recovered, and they're growing at a rate, I think, probably of about 2%, if that, which is not really enough to absorb new entrants to the labour market, which is why you've got over 20% youth unemployment, which terrifies the regime so much that when people started to talk about this outside of China, they simply stopped publishing these statistics on youth unemployment.
Really? That's interesting.
So a country that cannot, provide jobs for young people graduating from university is in a dangerous situation. So there is the most dangerous thing you can have in particular is unemployed, educated young men. There's a close correlation between that and levels of political unrest. So in that sense, yes, they don't have elections, but actually in order to stay in power, to maintain social order, they have to have an eye to the well-being and satisfaction of the Chinese people. It's not simply that they can do whatever they like, although of course they do have a freer hand than people who are subject to 2 to 4 year electoral cycles.
Yeah,
that point is well taken.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, like if the entire Chinese population just decided they no longer wanted the CCP in power, like that would be their end, probably.
Or even, well, imagine 1% of the Chinese population. That's a lot of people.
You think that's all it would take?
Right? That's not what I'm saying. I think if it was 1% of the population, probably the regime would be able to suppress them as long as that 1% wasn't inside the armed forces. But what I'm saying is, when you're governing a country as large as China, right, it is vast. The population is huge. It doesn't take everybody in the country to rise up against a regime. And this is why I think if you look at what Xi Jinping has done over the past 10 years or so, a lot of it has been about tightening the coercive tools of the state, surveillance and control, in order to offset the potential for internal threats and strengthening the security apparatus of the state. I think that CCP is afraid of its own people, probably rightly so. Not that I'm expecting it, a mass uprising against the CCP, not at all, because what the CCP has done is destroyed all other independent forms of social organization. There are no independent trade unions. There are no real other political parties in the country. The party penetrates all aspects of social and economic life, increasingly into even the private sector. So people may be discontented, but they don't have any organizations through which they can act collectively. So if there was unrest, it would be spontaneous, and that's what we have seen. We saw quite spontaneous protests against the dynamic zero COVID policy, which was totally insane, which did not cause the change in policy, in my judgment, but definitely would have rattled the regime. We've seen spontaneous labor protests, spontaneous civic protests around the property issue, for example. And also we're seeing these
mortgage strikes, right? Wasn't there?
Yes, mortgage strikes and kind of social mobilizations on the streets of people who had lost money over various housing issues. And there's also this phenomenon which you would have seen, I think, reported about sort of mass attacks, these sort of disaffected individuals who are, the courts ruled against them in some way, and then they commit atrocities, whether they attack people with a knife or they drive their car at people and kill civilians en masse. I mean, these are kind of isolated incidents. It's I don't want to say this is some epidemic, but these are all signs of societal discontent, as is the enormous level of capital flight out of China, right? So rich people continue to try and funnel their money out of China by hook or by crook, which tells you that they don't really see a future for themselves or their children in China. They don't think it's stable anymore. They don't think that their interests are going to be preserved by the regime. So it looks very solid and stable, and I don't want to say it's unstable or it's going to fall or something like that, but there are always cracks in these kinds of regimes.
Is the capital flight, is that definitely, do you think, people's sort of thought that the regime won't last, or is that maybe just a response to the fact that in a lot of countries in the West, money will buy you freedom, basically? It will, in the sense that, in the UK, for example, you can be a despot or an oligarch from somewhere in the global south, and you can come to London and we will help you wash your money and store it, and you can buy citizenship, you can get private security, you can have you can buy yourself for not that much money, plenty of influence with MPs, or you can buy gifts for members of the ruling party, and get possibly favorable treatment. Like you can do like Google and buy the tech ministers a hospitality package for Glastonbury, and then have their digital services tax reduced the next day. There's a lot of benefits to being wealthy in the West, and in China it doesn't seem to matter how much money you have, that you have to say one wrong word, like Jack Ma, for example, like the richest, I think he was the richest guy in China, and he just disappeared for a while. Is that, do you think it's more sort of the freedom aspect, like the fact that with enough money you can get out of China and put your money somewhere that's a little more free? Or do you think it really is their sort of thoughts that the regime might not last as long?
Yeah, sorry if I implied that they're sort of betting that the regime is going to collapse, then that's, I've not expressed myself properly. It is more, as you say, that their interests are no longer being served, that they don't see a future for themselves. It's not that they don't see a future for the regime necessarily. It's that the regime is no longer serving their interests as well as it once did. There has been, as part of this sort of wider tightening of control, there's been a tightening of control over the private sector, crackdowns on the tech sector, crackdowns on individual IPOs, individual entrepreneurs, as you've mentioned, and the overall sort of market sentiment of these people is now decidedly negative. So they're trying to get their money out because they probably want to get out themselves as much as possible, or the opportunities to make as much money through investment, which was often closely connected with corruption in the past. Those opportunities are drying up. So it's about their confidence in the regime and their confidence about themselves and their place in society, and their capacity to keep acquiring wealth, more than it is a sign of the idea that they think the regime is about to topple or something like that. I don't think they think that. It's not that. However, the scale of capital flight from China, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars a year, is a serious problem, which will have economic consequences, because that's money that perhaps in the past might have been reinvested in production in China, for example, and therefore or consumption within China, and could therefore have spurred economic growth. So if you've got capital flight, that's not a good thing, and that will have knock-on political consequences. So when capitalists go on strike, right, when they don't invest or when they take their money out of your economy, that's not very welcome for any capitalist state. And China is, of course, a capitalist state.
Yeah, I think people miss that. It might be like it's a weird pro-capitalism, but it is still like a state-driven capitalist economy. Yeah. Anyway, to the tariffs and the election of Donald Trump for the second time. The first time around, obviously, he made a big stink about China and how they, China was screwing them, and that they were gonna, fight back against them. And then he, slapped on some tariffs and sort of had a bit of a trade war to an extent, but it didn't really seem to be to have the impact or to be the size of the trade war that he claimed he was going to start with them. Basically, it was his bark was worse than his bite when he got into office, and this time round he seems to be promising basically the same thing he did the first time round in maybe in slightly different words, but that he wants to put tariffs on a lot of foreign imports, including Chinese imports. And do you think that he will? Do you think there'll be a major change in US policy, or do you think this will have like a significant impact in the second Cold War atmosphere, or do you think it will be sort of more like the first time round where it was maybe more tweaks and small things compared to what maybe people projected? Yeah,
so the first time round, a I mean, Trump did really initiate this period of much greater hostility between the United States and China with the trade war. Things had been, tricky at times between the two sides, but it was the Trump administration that declared that geopolitical rivals like China were the principal security challenge for the United States and not terrorists or non-traditional security threats. So Trump really initiated the new Cold War. But that, as I said earlier on, it's a bipartisan consensus now. So the Biden administration actually retained the Trump tariffs. So the tariff rate on China, the average tariff rate had been about 3.1% in 2018. And by 2023, it was 19.3%. And it affects 2/3 of Chinese exports. So the Biden administration kept the Trump tariffs and ramped them up very significantly in two main waves. So they're still targeting like particular sectors where there's evidence of dumping, or it's a strategic area relating to industrial policy. For example, solar panels, where the United States is trying to develop its own solar panel manufacturing sector. So the context is very different from 2016 because, back then there were no tariffs on Chinese goods. Trump introduced some. They turned out to be relatively modest. And if you look at economic calculations of what the impact of those were, it's surprisingly small. So, about 0.1% of GDP in the US and about 0.3% of GDP in China. So really quite small. When Trump's coming back in, he's coming back in where there's even bigger tariffs than he put on in the first place. But he's promising even bigger tariffs, because that's his sort of approach. Is I'm going to do bigger and better. So his suggestion is that he's going to put 60% tariffs on all Chinese imports to the United States. Forget the small yard and high fence. That's massive. Plus up to 20% tariffs on everybody else as well. Now, if that happened, that would be much more dramatic because we were talking about a much increased level of tariffs. Chinese trade with the United States has actually held up pretty well. It did dip in the first couple of years after the Biden tariffs, but then it recovered. And a lot of the trade is actually being rerouted through third countries. So supply chains are stretching rather than being broken. A 60% tariff on Chinese goods would probably accelerate that stretching of supply chains, but then Trump potentially could go after other people that were in these connector countries and try to stop them as well. So that would be extremely disruptive. So assuming that Chinese goods were at least in the short term, blocked from entering the US market, then the Chinese would look for other markets, and that would predominantly be in Europe. And so you get this flood of all kinds of other manufacturers into Europe, and Europe will be so overwhelmed, particularly in these strategic sectors they're trying to develop, that they would be compelled, I think, to try to impose their own tariffs in defense because they would say this is dumping. And then that would hasten the fragmentation of the global trading system. And then if Trump does follow through and say, we're going to impose 10% tariffs on everybody or up to 20% tariffs, that will obviously hasten fragmentation and create significant geopolitical tension between the United States and its own allies. Because it's not going to spare its allies, according to Trump. It's going to impose tariffs on everybody. Now, will he do it? We don't really know. But one reason to doubt it is that a tariff is a tax that an importer pays when they import something. Mm-hmm. So, people who know about trade policy know this is a very basic fact. But in the public imagination, I think some people seem to think, well, a lot of people seem to think that a tariff is something the Chinese are forced to pay somehow. It's the American importer that pays the tax. So the idea is the effect of a tariff is the importer thinks, well, that's too expensive now, so I'm not going to import it. So therefore the imports fall. But if they do import it and pay the tariff, then that tariff, the payment goes to the US government, right? So it's a tax on American consumption, which drives up prices in the United States. So something I would have bought, something I would have bought for $1 from China, the tariffs go to 60%. That now costs me $1.60, and the 60 cents goes to the US government. That's how a tariff works. So obviously it's inflationary, and steeply inflationary, given the amount of stuff that the United States imports from China. And we're not just talking here anymore, are we, about, toys or footwear or garments? We're talking about all kinds of consumer manufacturers. We're talking about components that the Department of Defense uses in its own supply chains for military equipment. China's everywhere. It can't be contained out there because it's already in here, so to speak. So the inflationary consequences would be immense. And given that I think inflation played a very significant role in the defeat of Kamala Harris and the re-election of Trump, and Trump has promised to cut inflation to nothing, quote, I think it would be, an act of self-immolation to impose that level of tariffs. So presumably when somebody explains to him with some nice charts or something, this will actually be the impact of these tariffs, I doubt that he'll do it. And my suspicion is also that he probably knows that already, but he's starting high with these big stick threats in order that he'll try and get some concession. He'll use it to leverage a deal. That's probably the way that he's thinking about it. But we just don't know. And that level of uncertainty about what Trump's global economic policies are going to be is creating all kinds of uncertainty and instability in markets already.
Yeah, I'm just honestly curious as to how it's going to go. I mean, there's like part of me when you listen to Trump talk about it, and he's like, we need to. He doesn't use these exact words, but like he wants to increase reshoring and like bring a lot of manufacturing back into the US. And he's like, we'll raise tariffs, but we'll almost abolish income tax, I think is basically his like dream plan. He wants to bring back the Gilded Age of US prosperity from the 1800s, I think is the pitch he basically makes. So I mean, I'm curious how far he gets with it. Basically, we'll see where it ends up, and how much of it is just talk, how much of it is completely unrealistic, just bluster, and I guess we'll see how everything plays out. So in the last,
there was very little reshoring under Trump. There has been a little bit under Biden, but not enormous amounts. And it takes a lot more than tariffs. I think you have to, to be effective, you have to combine some kind of trade policy with other kinds of policies like infrastructure construction, subsidies, loans, and so on to support these sectors to get onto their feet. And even then, it's tricky. As Biden has found, his industrial policy, I think, has not had the enormous payoffs that some people were suggesting at the start. But he's been much more kind of interventionist than Trump was. Trump relied on one very crude tool, tariffs, and just thought that would magically bring American companies scampering back to American shores. That hasn't happened by and large. Biden has been much more interventionist and strategic in trying to funnel money towards strategic sectors through targeted tax cuts, loans, grants for demonstration projects, these kinds of things in high-tech areas to try to attract factories back. And it's been a struggle for them, but they have been more successful than Trump was. So if Trump unwinds all that industrial policy stuff, which he has threatened to do, again, he might not do it because actually Republican districts have benefited the most from these projects. So he might not have the votes in Congress to just gut it completely. But if he does, and he just tries to rely on trade and hopes somehow that, his oligarchic supporters plunge all their wealth into rebuilding American industry, I think he'll be sorely disappointed, as people were in his first term.
Yeah, I feel that may not happen. Anyway, we'll see. You never know. Anyway, for the last sort of 10, 15 minutes, I wondered if I could ask you about the book you co-authored and released last year, if that's all right. The Taking Control, Sovereignty and Democracy After Brexit. Is that all right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mainly like, because it interests me because I wrote my own book about Brexit. It was about, mine was more about social media and tech and how that gets abused in political campaigns and disaster capitalism that was, exploited, or that I felt would be utilized in the aftermath of Brexit. And unfortunately, I think I've been somewhat correct in that, but not that very many people read the book or, listened, but, I was right. But anyway, I wanted to ask about the book because obviously, like, the UK is in like a strange sort of position at the moment. Like, we've attempted to sort of leave the garden of the European Union and the sort of ring-fenced trading bloc that it is, although that seems to be decreasing as they make trade deals with other parts of the world. South America, their farmers aren't so happy about that. And so we're not quite tied to the European Union anymore. We got told that the whole vote was about sovereignty, and I sort of got that argument. But do you think that that's like something that could realistically play out? Like, are we taking back control of our sovereignty in the post-Brexit world?
No, broadly we're not. Broadly, we have failed to reclaim sovereignty, I think largely because people don't really understand what sovereignty means. So what some people seem to think sovereignty means is total control over everything so that you can just choose whatever you want. And this sort of naive approach to sovereignty doesn't just manifest among, hard right Brexiteers or whatever. It manifests among Remainers too. So they're the kinds of people that say Ukraine has got a sovereign right to join NATO, for example. So you must, respect that sovereign right. Well, did the UK have a sovereign right to say, well, we want total access to the EU market, but without following any of the rules? Everybody thought that was ridiculous because, you've actually got another party that you've got to negotiate with, and if they don't want to give you what you want, then there is no right to it. So sovereignty doesn't mean total control. It doesn't mean that you can just impose your wishes on everybody else or get everything that you want. That's not what sovereignty is about. Sovereignty is having a government that is accountable to and responsive to the popular will, the people that it represents, and there is no higher authority above that government that can contradict the will of the people and make them follow other decisions and other rules. Now, it doesn't mean that you've got, to repeat my point, it doesn't mean that you can just do whatever you want. Right? Responsible sovereignty means, okay, we want this, but how do we get that in the world which is obviously composed of other sovereign states and other peoples with other attitudes and other interests? We have to navigate all of that internationally. But what we haven't got with Brexit is, first of all, we haven't broken decisively from EU rules because of the problem of Northern Ireland in particular. Northern Ireland is still totally subject to single market rules. And so the difficulty is, what do you do if you want to keep Northern Ireland inside the UK, but you don't want an internal border that splits off the EU governed bit from the rest of the UK? And the solution, effectively, that the British government has adopted, there's been different variations of this solution, but the solution effectively is not to deviate from EU rules, so that there is no real departure from EU-style governance. Yes, there are some bits and bobs here and there where you think, oh, well, actually, you couldn't really have done that if you were inside the EU, but actually, particularly because of the Northern Ireland issue, If you were to diverge from EU rules, you would see a hard border established between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and that's what ruling elites don't want. So actually, Northern Ireland is a fetter on British sovereignty. It keeps us tied to the European Union. And so we argue in the book that the only way to restore the sovereignty of the British people is to recognise that the British state is not sovereign in Northern Ireland, and in fact we should support the reunification of Ireland under a single Irish republic, and then we would be much freer to determine our own rules for ourselves. But the bigger problem is that we're never going to have a government at the moment that will be bold enough to take that step, because we don't have political parties that represent ordinary people and are willing to take bold and decisive steps to break from the established way of doing things, which includes, going along with EU regulations. So we haven't really made very much use of the freedom to change the way that we do things in this country, to enact a real industrial policy, for example, that could revitalise the British economy, to impose capital controls, which you would need to do to prevent bond markets punishing you for trying to do anything a bit different. We haven't done any of those things. We're still stuck in what we call in the book. We say we're a post-member state. So we haven't become a nation state again, one where the government is responsive to the will of ordinary people. We've still got this hangover of a kind of EU-style governance. And at the heart of that is the political problem of the crisis of representation, where political parties are not responsive to the broad masses of the people. So there was a poll just before the last UK general election. 60% of people don't feel represented by any of the political parties. There's a huge gulf, a void between ordinary people and the people that claim to represent them. That's in fact why we got to Brexit in the first place, we argue in the book, right? It's that void that people were sick of it and they voted for a change, but the void remains. We have left the European Union, which kind of institutionalized this void by having rules that were made between elites, between national elites, without really any consultation of or involvement of the people, without much regard for what ordinary people thought and wanted, that institutionalized that crisis, that delinking of the people and the elites. So we've left there. That's not locking us in anymore. But the political problem of the disjuncture between the people and the elites, that remains. The void remains to be filled. So the underlying political problem remains. And we set out, that's the thesis of the book. The void explains how we got to Brexit. It explains why Brexit was such a shambles. It explains why things haven't gotten any better. And it sets out what we need to do to try to rebuild representative democracy in the UK. We need to democratise the state. And then you might have a government that actually has some will to make some changes and take us in a new direction. But at the moment, we don't.
Would that involve reforming the voting system in your mind?
Yes. So, for many years I was opposed to proportional representation, but now I think it's the only way to destroy the established parties, which I think is necessary. The established parties have shown that they're completely incapable of self-renewal. They are zombified. They're hollow shells that are largely disconnected from the people that they claim to represent. They're not offering anything new at all. They're offering either reheated Thatcherite policies in the sense of the Tories, or a kind of a drab, grey, funereal version of New Labour in the form of the Labour Party. And neither of them are capable of offering any hope or future to the country. So they've had their chance to reinvent themselves, to offer something new, to reconnect with the electorate. That was what the Brexit crisis was really about. And they've completely failed. And so the first past the post system is unfortunately propping up these zombie parties that don't really deserve to be propped up anymore. So you have in the case of Keir Starmer's Labour Party, they got a third of the vote and 2/3 of seats in Parliament.
Yeah.
It's one of the most malapportioned parliaments on the planet.
Yeah. 3 million
and that
less
can't be
votes
right.
3 million less votes than Jeremy Corbyn got in 2017, which is insane.
Yes, when he lost.
Yeah, when he lost.
Right? And if we, let me just look at the stats, because you're right that they got 34% of the votes, 33.7% of the votes this time round, which, as you say, is lower than when Corbyn lost the election in 2017, because he got 40%.
Yeah.
And 33.7% is not much more than Corbyn got in 2019. He got 32.1% of the vote. And that was the worst defeat for the Labour Party since the 1930s. Yeah. So for all this talk about how Keir Starmer has, rescued the Labour Party and changed it and won back the confidence of the people, absolutely not. People voted to get rid of the Tories. Only 5% of people who voted Labour did so because of their policies, because they didn't really offer any policies. So we come to the conclusion in the book that proportional representation is the only way to smash the established oligarchy of these dilapidated, zombified political parties, which are relics of the 20th century, right? They used to represent organized blocks of opinion, classes in particular, the working class in the case of the Labour Party, the property classes in the case of the Conservatives. They no longer do those things. That was their purpose. They don't do it anymore, and they're completely incapable of running the country effectively. It's very obvious. So proportional representation, I think, is the only way to either make these political parties more responsive to what ordinary people want and more accountable, and therefore save themselves, or to be swept away by innovators. But we do say in the book that it's not just PR that we need, it's PR plus, if you like. It's a range of other reforms that would be needed to incentivize the creation of new parties that were genuinely responsive to ordinary people. So, for example, one of the things would be reform to the way that political parties are funded. So to effectively ban corporate donations, which would include donations by the trade unions, not just companies, and limit individual donations to about £1,000 a year. So if you want to survive as a political party, you need money. How are you going to get money? Go and attract lots of small donations from ordinary people and build up a mass of popular support. So it's when you put all the different reforms together that we suggest in the book, that would lead to a slow, protracted, but and difficult, but progress and movement towards a more democratic society that we just don't have at the moment. But proportional representation, I think, just has to be part of the mix now.
Yeah, and I think a reform to the way the parties are funded would also be a really important step forwards. I mean, it's would you back like some sort of public funding for the parties on top of like the?
No, not at all.
No, nothing was so.
Not at all. They don't deserve it. Why should public money be used to prop up political parties? In some countries it is, right? So in some European countries, you get funding based on how many seats you get, which essentially just is a sort of way of perpetuating this oligarchy. I think you need a way of forcing the political parties to go among the people, right? And to convince the people to support them economically. And the parties that have been most successful, I think, at doing that and attracting large numbers of small donations. If you think about Bernie Sanders' campaign, for example, even Obama was better at doing that, right? They were kind of more responsive to what ordinary people wanted and less captured by big corporate interests. So, and that's, I mean, those are only very partial examples because, especially in the United States, corporate power is enormous and corporate influence over the parties is vast. But I think that they have to be forced. This is the thing, like if they didn't have to be forced, you wouldn't have to bring in all these things, but clearly they have to be forced, right? They're not going to do it of their own free will to become more responsive to ordinary people. They don't want to do it. The evidence of our eyes over the past 8 years is that, you've got the Tory party going through convulsions at the moment. And what do they all agree on? We need to be more conservative. We need to be more, smaller government and free markets. That kind of policy package is supported by about 6% of the public.
Is that it?
Right. This is a party that is wildly out of whack with what the average person on the street thinks. They're wildly out of whack with the people that voted for them in 2019. Mm-hmm. If you remember when Liz Truss became prime minister and she had this Thatcherite, Big Bang idea, they were polling people who voted Conservative in 2019, the people that elected Boris Johnson and this enormous Tory majority that had about 90 majority. Mm-hmm. People forget that it was a very large majority government despite all the instability. What did they want? The vast majority of people wanted either higher taxes and spending or taxes and spending to remain the same. Only a very small minority, I think it was about 30% of Tory voters in 2019, wanted lower taxes. And when you package all these different things together, lower taxes, smaller states, less public spending, all the rest of it, you package those things together and say, is that what you want? The public don't want it. The public have had 40 years of Thatcherite policies. And when they look around, they see social decay, crime and disorder, dysfunctional public services, the plundering of the Commonwealth by large corporate interests, and they're sick of it. They want an alternative. And that's what the Brexit vote was about. It wasn't a vote for trade deregulation and free ports, right? That's the extent to which the right-wing Brexiteers had no idea what the people wanted. They weren't representing the people. They were dragged under Johnson into a more social democratic politics. If COVID hadn't happened, it's interesting to think the direction that Johnson was taking the Tories in was one that was much more about levelling up. It was much more about having an industrial policy. It was about trying to revitalise the economy. I'm doubtful it would have gone that far. No. But that's the direction he was taking them in, which was to be more responsive to where the actual voters are. Whereas the rest of the Tory party seem to be so up in the clouds that they think, Margaret Thatcher was so great, what we need is more Thatcherite policy. And that's just not what people want. No. And that's just the Tories. And obviously the Labour Party have got nothing particularly to offer, really, either.
They've got, I think the real, this awful problem is that the money that does get spent on public services is utterly wasted, because we have this system where public services are provided by private corporations to a large extent. So we lose all of the money, and well, not all the money. We lose a large portion of the money and the accountability to no bid contracts and like faceless companies to whom things are outsourced. Like, it might be like the NHS, but it's increasingly not the NHS. It's like whatever private corporation has, won the contract. And then once you do that, the money, like, it zooms off and it goes through like several different like shell companies, and then the lawyers and the solicitors take their money. It maybe floats offshore for a bit. Some more money gets taken out. Dividends get paid to shareholders, and eventually the money that does get spent on the public service is far less than would be spent if you just had it nationalized. And I'm not like some crazy like, let's nationalize everything, but I'd like them to pick a lane. It's either let it be completely private and regulate it well, or nationalize it and let like a government run entity like actually run it, and not this like weird worst of both worlds hybrid that we've ended up in.
It's absolutely right. We've got the worst of the state and the worst of the market in the UK. In every single field, there is kind of overweening, inefficient bureaucracy and just reams and reams of kind of pointless regulation, which often isn't effectively enforced, but is a barrier to development in a lot of areas. So that the planning system, for example, is, I think, utterly dysfunctional. And yet you also have the kind of worst of the market. So the worst sort of predatory behaviors, the poor regulatory compliance, the the parasitic nature of these companies, as you say, these contractors that just feed continuously off the state, don't innovate, don't invest. Rates of investment in the UK are incredibly low, near to the very bottom of the OECD. There is very little investment in new technology, in productivity. Companies are very happy to just extract rents, to employ lots of low-wage people in low value-added service work. So this country combines the worst of a bureaucratic and wasteful and sclerotic bureaucracy with a sclerotic, non-innovating, lazy capitalist class. And that's why the economy is broadly stagnant. And until we can fix those things, it's very difficult to see how we can move forward. And even in sectors like the NHS, where I think people think that somehow private companies have sort of taken over the NHS, and actually their share of NHS services is quite small. I think it's less than 10%. But in order to facilitate their participation, the NHS has been marketized. So there is an internal market within the NHS. So different bits of the NHS have to contract with each other and compete with each other. It's just incredibly wasteful and bureaucratic. So this is a good example of this combination of market, so the internal market inside the NHS, plus bureaucracy, because in order to facilitate a market inside a health service, you need enormous levels of bureaucracy to create this fake market. And that's happened across all the different sectors. It happens in universities, for example. It's a total mess. So we need a new approach. Now, I can't tell you, here's my 5,000 point plan to rescue Britain. I don't think it can't be one person's job to come up with that. What we need is a revitalization of our democracy so that new parties, new forms of representation can be invented and allow new ideas to come forward. Because at the moment, they're just not. We're in a period of stagnation and even decline. And people, I think, are starting to lose hope. And when there is this void between people and their representatives, and when there is economic stagnation, and when people start to lose hope in the future, then they start to lose faith in democracy. And then we really are in a dangerous situation. So if we don't democratize the state, if we don't rebuild representative democracy, then we will just have endless populist eruptions, as we're seeing across all of the so-called advanced democracies, because they're all suffering from very similar structural problems.
Well, on that cheery note, I think that's a lovely place to end. Although it is nice to hear some other people diagnosing problems that I felt are, very, very much at the forefront of British politics. So I'll put the link for your book and stuff in the description below. Is there anything else you'd like to plug while we're still here?
For those people who remain on Twitter, they can follow me at Dr. Lee Jones.
Yeah, the exodus.
I'm not moving to Blue Sky.
The exodus from Twitter will not last. It will not last. That is my prediction for 2025. They'll all be back because I've watched them leave.
I'm not so sure about that. I think they'll stay on Blue Sky and it'll just become this kind of liberal echo chamber where they're all super nice to each other, and Twitter will continue to become increasingly dysfunctional and useless as a place to sort of take the temperature and understand what a range of different people and people from different walks of life and different political perspectives think. That was its great utility, Twitter as the public square where you could hear what lots of different people were saying and thinking. That utility has been greatly lost, but you don't get it back by retreating into a liberal echo chamber and sticking your fingers in your ears.
Well, anyway, we'll see what happens. I mean, I'm unsure what will happen, but I think they'll be back because I've watched them leave numerous times. It's just my feeling. I mean, it's hard to tell what's actually going to happen with the space itself and the way its algorithm works, which I think it seemed like it might have been getting better, and then it seems to have got worse. And I can't tell.
I think it is broken. I think it just doesn't It doesn't do what it used to do in the past by showing you stuff that you're interested in. Engagement with posts is extremely low. It is just broken. And you would think that they would be able to see that from their own dashboards and usage data, right? That people are not spending as much time on it as before. Kind of engagement rates are very low, etc. But they don't seem to be doing anything about it. They just seem to be focused on trying to monetize the platform in various ways, which I don't think is very successful. No. So it's a real shame of, what happens when somebody takes over a platform and runs it very badly, runs it into the ground. Sympathetic as I was to Musk's points about freedom of speech, as somebody that was absolutely shadow banned for a number of years, I get it, and I think there shouldn't be online censorship, but he's gone so far that he's broken it, right? And now he's going to have the chance to do that with the American state.
Yeah. Well, much to look forward to. Anyway,
buckle up.
Yeah, literally. Anyway, yeah, I'll put your Twitter in the description and the link for your book and everything. But yeah, thanks, man. Absolute pleasure. Really interesting chat.
Pleasure. Nice to talk to you again.
Hey, listeners, real quick. Do you ever find yourself sitting watching the stock market like this? Well, now you could instead be ordering my book like this. It's the story of GameStop. You can purchase it with a hoodie, with acknowledgements, or just with the early backers edition. It's all about the GameStop story. It's the real story, not just what you've seen on films. It's exactly what has happened over the last 3.5 years. And with DFE back, I'm finally able to draw a conclusion to my book. Please pre-order it. It really helps me out, and you will get it eventually, I promise. Hopefully this year.